activity over here by the table. My name is Stefan Kirkeby. This is Julie Casemore. We have a gallery space next door here in Minnesota Street. Julie, she's also the director for Minnesota Street here for the entire Minnesota Street project. I don't know how she does it. Anyhow, this is just a real big honor for all of us here to have all the great photographers here that we have at the table: Charles Long, Stan Zernick, David Johnson, Stephen Goldstein, Jerry Ratto, and Ken, Paul, and Victoria, wherever they are running around here. They're also to be thanked tremendously for their incredible devotion to see this book come true. This is the new Steidl release, and we're having an exhibition in 2 weeks from now at the Laguna Art Museum. It's not going to be the work you see. There'll be works by these artists, but this is staying here until the end of the month. So simultaneously, there's the same show. I wanted to just bring in someone like Jeff Gunderson and Jack Fulton a little bit, just if they could say some words about the Golden Decade period of photography, just a little bit, because I could go into it, but I'm probably going to miss 100 things. So I want to thank you, Stefan. Thank you very much. Jeff?
I sort of got attached to this thing 35 years ago when I started work at the San Francisco Art Institute's library. And my office is right next to where the archives is for the Art Institute. And right there was this great paper trail, the umbilical to, essentially the beginnings of that photography program that Ansel and Meyer White started there in 1945, 1946. And I also got attached to it through Purple Jones, who was teaching there at that time, because he was a faculty member there and a wonderful photographer and a good friend. And he had been a student in that very first class of Ansel's and Meyer's and Dorothea Lange's, Imogen Cunningham, and Lizette Modell, who appeared on the scene, and others. And I also thought, somebody should write about this. Somebody needs to write about this. Why aren't they writing about it? And I'd tell faculty members, and they'd be intrigued, but they didn't, it wasn't their thing, And then finally, about 10 or 12 years later, Ira Latour and Bill Hyke and Cam McCauley, whose pictures are in here, who grace this room, up here, as this triumvirate. I think they called themselves the three, Mouseketeers, but they're musketeers, and they thought they would do this thing. And so they started to plow away doing it, and yet they would quibble and fight and argue, and Ira would want to write 2 volumes, let's make it 2 volumes, and my autobiography. And so but they continued to move forward in it. But it wasn't until Ken and Victoria took over this project where it really started to get momentum, and eventually 100 copies of a prototype of the Golden Decade was done, and then Steve Goldstein said, you should pitch this to Steidl, the premier photography publisher in the world. And sure enough, Steidl picked it up, and now you have the rest of the story. The book is here. Purchase the book. It's terrific. Look at these photographs. There are people here who were in those first classes, like Charles Long, whose photo essay on the Year of the Dragon was one of the first things published in Aperture magazine. Steve Goldstein, who was the youngest student of that time period, he was 13 years old or so at one point, as a student of minors, but has this wonderful self-portrait of him with Edward Weston. Jerry Ratto, Stan Zernick, David Johnson, all their photographs that are here too. So enjoy looking at all those things. And make sure you look at contact photography, contact print photography like those over there that are just so stupendous. And Jack Fulton knows this stuff from a different angle as a photographer, and as somebody who taught at the Art Institute for all those years and to live with that legacy from the 1940s, which continues to this day.
I can hardly add anything to what he said.
Yes, you can, Jeff.
But all this sort of started in an interesting way when Jeff was talking about when the department started in 1946, the first classes, and mind you, it was fine art, it was not commercial photography. This back wall over here is similar to a show, was it called Perceptions? Perceptions, that was put together, and the idea was to have the masters like Ansel and Edward Weston and Dorothea and Imogen along with students and other people, with no titles, no matting, no frames, no signatures on the wall, so people could look at photography and see it as the purity of what the mind's eye saw, not just an eye. Like we always, with our eye, we look at something, okay, that's a pretty rock or a vase of flowers to take a photograph. The whole institution was running around, going from the heart and the mind and seeing what you see and trying to make, you might say, visual metaphors or equivalents, which Miner had picked up from Mr. Stieglitz in New York. The show Perceptions was put up first before this famous Family of Man photography show was put together. In fact, all the guys here who were part of that Perception show, they didn't like Mr. Stieglitz too much because he wanted to take their negatives and make good prints out of them. And they wanted to make their own prints. So immediately there was this kind of East Coast and West Coast dichotomy that was set up. And then slowly but surely, we had few students. Most of these guys were in the war. They had fought in World War II or came in the GI Bill. And the department stayed quite quiet until Jerry Bichard came in, and then we hired Perkel. We rebuilt the photography department, took out Ansel Adams' old dark rooms, which had no ventilation, no nothing, and rebuilt it. And then another war came along, Vietnam War, and the school grew to over 1,100 people. And we had about 400 people inside the photography department. And it's just stayed that way with the same institutional goal of seeing with your heart and with your mind. And even though some people have been extremely successful in the commercial world, the most well-known is Andy Leibovitz, who works for Vanity Fair. But there are exceptions. People have run other departments, they've worked for corporations. We don't hear about them, but the whole goal is really art and fine art. And if any of you are interested, you can go to the school now, and Jeff has put up a nice little exhibit in the library, I mean not in the library, in the gallery, and you can go upstairs and research a lot of this stuff if you want. As a minor thing too, was it Albert Bender?
Albert Bender.
Albert Bender, who helped establish the Asian art collection here. He loved photography. He paid for Ansel Adams' first portfolio called the Parmelian Portfolio and supported the school. And in our library where Jeff works, there's a little monument to Mr. Bender and his cousin, Ann Bremer, who is the librarian.
One contextual thing about this group of artists, this group of photographers, is that they were there at the Art Institute at a very rich time in the transition within art. You know, it's post-World War II. Many of them are on the GI Bill. They're wrestling with all those issues of the Holocaust, the atom bomb, and World War, 2 world wars in many of their lives. And they're dealing not just with photography, but with painting. Clifford Still, Mark Rothko are teaching painting there. David Park is starting to figure out, should I do figurative painting? They're starting to do filmmaking, avant-garde filmmaking at the same time. They're starting to do that Bay Area, you know, kind of raw assemblage stuff at the same time. And so it's a very rich period contextually with everything, but the photography is one thing that is just dynamite to see in that same context with all that other stuff that's going on in the art world of San Francisco.
Yeah, I'd like to kind of try one thing. I'd like to see if I can get David Johnson just to stand here for a second, just to say a few words because he's amazing to listen to. David.